plan of God for every one of his children is to heal us. Now, there's so much confusion about this. You're probably not surprised to hear that. There's so many extreme views one way and another, and throughout the history of the church, sadly, there have been many charlatans, still are, wanting to take advantage of hurting people, falsely claiming God's power to heal. I mean, just watch a film like American Gospel, or just watch some YouTube videos of these so-called healers getting debunked. But God's revealed plan in the Bible for his people is healing. So much so that in our reading, at the end there, in verse 26, God described himself as the Lord, or Yahweh, who heals you. That's Yahweh Rophe or Ropheka in Hebrew, the Lord your healer, the Lord who heals you. It's a name. It describes who he is. Healing is in some way essential to his character. It's a big part of what he is about. And that's what we're thinking about tonight. Let's start with the word if. Now, perhaps you noticed that word appear in these verses we're looking at just from verse 22 onwards. It's an important word, so we're going to take it as our first heading. If. I couldn't help but hear that poem as I read it. You'll be a man, my son, if. Let's remind ourselves of the situation here at the end of chapter 15. God has brought Israel out of Egypt. That's what the first part of the book of Exodus is all about. That's where it gets its name from. Exodus, out of, departure. When Jesus is speaking with Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration, they're talking about his exodus, his departure. Well, this is the departure from Egypt. Now, immediately before this chapter, you probably realized, Israel was trapped by the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, as the army of Pharaoh, with all their chariots, the tanks of the ancient world, they came to destroy them. Because Pharaoh eventually, after the plague of the firstborn, he let Israel go, and he kind of changed his mind. He was like, what am I doing? Let's go and kill them. Well, with the army there, God stepped between Israel and that army. He physically interposed himself, and he opened a path through the sea so that the whole nation passed over on dry ground. When Pharaoh's army and all those chariots tried to follow them, the sea came down on their heads, destroying them. It's a kind of double deliverance. They're brought out of the sea, out of the chaos of the water, and out of the violent hands of Pharaoh and his army. It's a clear display, isn't it, of God's might and power. He's a warrior, like Moses sings in his song. But now, in the desert on the other side of the Red Sea, the Israelites, who were so excited that they joined Moses in singing the song that takes up most of this chapter, they meet their first difficulty since that deliverance, and they start to grumble. Now, doesn't that sound familiar to you? Now, and I'm speaking about myself here as well. You see God come through time and time again, and you meet a little adversity, and it could be significant adversity, because if they've been in the desert without water for 3 days, that means they're all going to die if they don't find water. And then they find some water, but it's no good. It's horrifying to think about, isn't it? So we're not talking about, you face a little, it wasn't a big thing. It was a big deal. And we're the same. The adversity we face might be a little thing, or it might be a big thing, but either way, we're suddenly doubting whether God will come through or not, no matter how many times we've seen him do miraculous things before. And we can sympathize all too easily with the Israelites, can't we? In fact, they probably had more excuse than we do because they knew less about God than we do. They didn't have a Bible. Didn't have a Bible at all. Remember, at this point, they just don't know God very well. They don't know what he's like. They don't know what he can do. They don't know his capabilities. They've probably heard the stories of their ancestors because, very rich oral tradition. They'll have passed down these stories. But God is an unknown in many ways. Now, they've just seen him deliver them militarily. But remember, again, I've said this several times in this series, they live in a world of little gods. They have gods of rain, gods of fertility, gods of war, gods of commerce. You have a god or a demon of the wilderness, a god or demon of goats. You have all these sort of gods with restricted spheres of influence. So they've just seen that the God of Israel is a God with power, real power, they don't doubt that, but they've seen his power to kill, power to destroy, power over the sea. So providing drinkable water in the desert, well, they just don't think that's in his wheelhouse. They just don't think that this God can provide that. It'd be great if they were facing an army, but, they're not facing an army. They're facing a complete lack of water. They and their herds are going to die. You can make a path through the sea, but he's no good now. That's what their grumbling comes from. And so in response, God, who's weaning them out of their paganism, that's what the whole Exodus and wilderness wanderings are about. He's showing them how, contrary to all of the religion that they knew, he alone is to be worshipped. You read it in chapter 15, verse 11. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? That's not just rhetoric. That's from this belief that there are many gods, but there is none among them who's to be worshipped but Yahweh. He alone is to be worshipped because he alone can meet every single one of their needs. And so he puts them to a test. He issues a ruling. We read it in verse 26. If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, and then that same idea is repeated in this beautiful parallel. If you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, that's kind of the same idea reflected or with an intensity added. I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. You see, God makes available, he puts on the table, if you like, incredible blessing, incredible healing. He said, if you can do this, then you're not just going to have water, you're going to have so much more. He's offering protection, he's offering restoration and preservation of body. If you were to flick ahead, you don't have to, but if you were to flick ahead in the Old Testament to Numbers 21, you could read about how he healed the Israelites from a plague of serpents. These fiery serpents that were biting them, and people were dying from the bites, but then they raised up a bronze serpent. Whoever looked at it is healed. God heals them of these venomous serpent bites. But the fact that this declaration here in verse 26 comes after their grumbling is a sign that there's a deeper level of healing on offer. Because the Israelites, they might have come out of Egypt, but they brought Egypt with them. And they brought their paganism with them. And God is offering to heal them of it. Heal them from the damage it's done to them. To their relationships with each other, to their relationship with him, the Creator God. He can heal the scars of their spiritual adultery and ignorance. He can heal all the wounds of their past. And remember, they've been living as slaves for hundreds of years. They probably carry very real scars on their backs. He can heal them of all the defilement of living in pagan land. He can heal their hard hearts and their faithless attitudes. If they can listen to him and walk with them, he will be their healer. Well, that's a big if, isn't it? And we know, because we've got the whole Old Testament to read, that this is a test that the people of Israel will fail big time, over and over again. How long have they been at Sinai? 40 days before they've made an idol and started worshipping that? Because that's what they know. the vast majority of Israelites won't pass this test. And so rather than blessing, they'll bring about the same curse that the Egyptians came under. And it'll end tragically with the exile. God makes them a great offer. It's a good offer. It's not like he's trying to catch them out. It's a good offer if they can keep the terms, which neither they nor us can. But moving on to our second point, I want you to notice the wording that God chose. I'm a big fan of a countertext here. A countertext is what the Bible could have said but doesn't. Here's another way you could have said what you said but you didn't, because it's important. Every word is important. Notice what God said. He didn't say, if you do this, I will be the Lord who heals you. And I checked this in more literal translations, the NIV, just to make sure I wasn't going off. He says, if you do this, I am the Lord who heals you. So we're going to take I am as our second heading. God, you see, isn't telling them about the cause and effect of obedience and blessing. He's telling them about who he is. Now, he reveals this name, as with every one of his names, as an expression of his identity. That's not a complicated thought, is it? This is who he is, regardless of their response to him. He's not who he might be, if only. When they fail this test, he's still going to be the Lord who heals you. Now, as I said, God is working on Israel's heart through the wilderness wanderings and the giving of the law of Moses. He's preparing them and teaching them, getting them ready for what he, not they, will do. And you see that throughout chapter 15. You've got the comparison of what Pharaoh and his army says, I will do that. Look at all I'm going to do. And it doesn't happen, does it? And then you get the contrast of that. Sort of in verses 16, 17, you will bring them and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance. The Lord you made for your dwelling. It's about what God does, not about what anyone else does. What God will do to guarantee the healing that it is his essential character to give. Now, the Old Covenant, the Sinai Covenant, was an arrangement that offered blessing when the people responded faithfully. You kind of hear a pre-echo or a foreshadowing of that here. And it brought curse and disaster when they didn't. And you can read that here. If you do this, I won't bring on you any of the curses. So the implication is, if you don't do this, I will bring the curses that I brought on the Egyptians. Now, God is always merciful in the way he executes his judgment against Israel. I always point this out, that the punishment never seems to be the full punishment that God could have brought about. It's like God is always pulling his punches against Israel. He's slow to anger. He gives time for repentance. But because of the stiff necks of his people, the old covenant ended up bringing them wounding, not healing. It ended up condemning them and actually driving them further away from God because of their own sinful hearts. And that sounds familiar to us, doesn't it? Now, we're Gentiles here tonight, as far as I know, so we've never been under the law of Moses. We're not under the law. But when we think of God's rules and commandments, there is great blessing in keeping them. Do this and you shall live. It's good. If we can. But we can't, can we? Not any better than ancient Israel. But God's plan is to heal. And like we've seen in the book of Genesis, it was always to heal all the nations, not just Israel. But we've got to wonder, how is this vast gulf between the character of God and the reality of our sinful hearts, how is that going to be bridged? Now, God, as we know, is a God of justice. He does not leave the guilty unpunished, he says in Exodus 34. Now, it almost seems as if we've set up a situation where there's a war about to happen within God's own character. But I don't think I'm going to surprise any of you tonight with where I'm going with this. Because as for all of the Old Testament, the law, even this test, was preparing Israel for Jesus. Because God's will to heal is so great that he, in the person of the eternal Son, came into this world to make it happen in spite of our disobedience. In spite of us not keeping the if, the I am would make it happen. And we see, don't we, the will and power of Jesus to heal throughout his life and ministry. You think of the vast crowds in the Gospels who come to Jesus and were not turned away, but we read a couple of times, all were healed. All were healed. As many as came to him and wanted healing, got healing. Think of the leper in Matthew 8 who comes to Jesus. Remember what he says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. What does Jesus say? I am willing. Be clean. But as for Israel, Jesus is concerned about so much more than bodily healing. Because disease is just a symptom of the underlying disease that all humanity is suffering under. What we could say, the effects of the fall, the effects of the curse, the effects of living outside the presence of God, outside the source and foundation of reality. We can't get to the tree of life to eat its leaves of healing. If we're outside of the presence of God, that means we're moving further from our own identity and drifting further and further from the I am. So the Son comes to suffer the curse that we deserve, that sinful Israel deserved for failing this and so many other tests. Think of, and I'm sure it's deliberate, think of the darkness that fell on all Egypt, that's the phrase, in Exodus chapter 10. Then think of darkness that fell over all the land while Jesus hung on the cross. It was a sign that he was taking the promised curse onto himself so that he could bring absolute healing on the object of his mercy. Isaiah 53 verse 5 says, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Neither Israel nor us could earn God's healing, but it is in God's character to give healing to all who will receive it. Not only to mend our bodies in a way so that illness and death can return and take away the gift, but to make of us a new creation over which death has no claim or power. To heal our sin and its effects, to heal our brokenness. It's everything in us, like I was talking about last week, just the frustrations of life and the annoyances at your own character, your own misjudgments, to heal all of that, to restore the shattered relationship between us and God, to us and each other, even to us and creation. Think of elsewhere in Isaiah, it talks about the leopard lying down with the lamb. Kids playing by a cobra's nest and reaching in, and the mother's not horrified because there's no harm that's going to happen. We're not even at war with creation anymore. God, the Lord, your healer, guarantees himself the ultimate blessing through Jesus. We need to know God's essential character as healer. It is who he is. It's a part of who he is. We won't understand him properly if we don't understand that. Maybe we're like the Israelites there in the desert of Shur. We think, oh yeah, God can wipe out an army, but can he provide the water we need? Can he fix a broken body? Can he fix a broken heart? Or is he more concerned with trashing these armies who oppose him? Well, God is a one-stop shop, brothers and sisters. He can do it all. Now, I have to say this, that it doesn't mean, as some mistakenly and harmfully teach, and I could get angry about this because I usually do, that Christians are promised in this life we will never suffer illness if only we are faithful. Now, you might have heard that. Or else that illness and disease only ever come as a result of personal sin. So if you're ill, you must have done something wrong. There must be even some secret sin that you're not aware of. And God's punishing you, because if you were faithful, then he'd bless you and you wouldn't get ill. That is not true, and this is why I get so angry about it. Just think of the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh. It's described as a messenger of Satan. It's not sent because of his sin, but to keep him from sinning. So he doesn't get proud in this great vision he had. And 3 times the Apostle Paul prayed for it to be removed without success. Because, hear this, God had a greater plan for Paul in his suffering than in his bodily healing. Now, it will be a bold and a foolish Christian who claimed that they had a greater faith than the Apostle Paul. They can argue that out with him. I've got nothing to say to them. We're not promised never to experience illness this side of the resurrection, but we need to know God as healer, because that is where we are ultimately heading. And it's what God is doing in us every day, every minute we spend in the wilderness, with every trial, every thorn that he sends us. Even by the wounds that we suffer, he is healing us and restoring us. It is his plan. It is where we will end if we are his. But although we can't claim any promise, when we understand God's character, can we understand that it is still sometimes his will to heal us bodily as well? Sometimes he uses doctors to do it. Sometimes he uses medication. And sometimes he doesn't. He just responds directly to the prayers of his people. We are encouraged to pray for healing. We had this in the end of James, didn't we? James 5:14-15 says, "Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up." Now, I've never been asked to do that. I don't know if Phil has. No one's ever asked me to come and anoint them with oil and pray over them in faith that the Lord will heal them. Because we just don't think God works that way. The Lord who heals you. When we understand that this is how God has revealed himself, will we find the faith to pray, expecting God to heal, and yet not lose our faith if he reveals that it's his will to do something better for us, something better in us, something that better grows us in the absolute, permanent, full healing that is a certain future for all those who stand forgiven and whole in Jesus. Let's sing our final hymn, number 600, "Approach My Soul, the Mercy Seat," 600.